And then I'll go a little bit deeper into RPA and AI in terms of what that overall process looks like, along with some of the ML models and the all-important data set. Daniel will spend time talking about the ever-important business rules, along with discussing overall solution performance and model performance and how they tie together. And then we'll end with the very important data labeling and some best practices there. So let's talk about the most important thing. The most important thing in any document processing solution is to prioritize your business goals. And so if I look at maybe my as-is document processing, I've got a document source where documents come in from various locations, and then I have to basically get that data out and put it into a system of record. Now, what we need to do is we need to figure out what would be valuable about providing automation here. And so we find with all of our customers, it really falls into three buckets. The first one being they just want to have a more efficient FTE processing these documents. So we're going to increase the document throughput per FTE. The second is the overall processing time end to end, meaning there's some sort of data in the document that's very important, and there's an SLA with turning around that data that sits in there. So a loan package would be a great example of that. And then finally, we want to improve data entry accuracy. And so this is avoid duplication or rework, meaning even if you have a document where it only takes a minute to get the data out, if that data doesn't get in right, there may be some substantial rework involved. So I have to spend 30 minutes going unhooking everything that was done because that one small mishap. So we find some there. So the key here for you, it's best to prioritize these three. And based on that, you'll be able to tie some sort of business value. Now, in general, it revolves around the time it takes to process the as-is time today, along with the volume of documents. And so in this case, I'm showing there's a triage. Maybe you have to split up a file into multiple documents. Maybe you have to forward them to other individuals. And then there's the actual processing of the data, verifying, and then also extracting. And so when we look at measuring the solution, here's an example here where, so 12 minutes total, 100,000 documents, that's about 20,000 hours. That's our baseline metric we can work off of to understand if there's actually value or not, or how to optimize for further value. And when we look at the measuring the value of an automated solution, there's something called a straight-through processing rate. So those documents go through the system from the very source all the way to the destination, and they never touch a human. But then inevitably, a human is involved in some percentage. So what time are they taking to actually process the data that didn't get processed automatically? And so correlating this time spent to business value is a big key piece of this. So double clicking here on terminology. So we talked about straight-through processing, or the straight-through processing rate. The inverse of that would be the human-in-the-loop rate, or HITL, shown here. In that if it didn't go straight through, it probably goes to a human to get validated. There is a third bucket. Sometimes we see documents come through that just don't need to be there. It's the wrong type of document. It's a cover sheet or something like that. Those would be discarded. But the culmination of the straight-through processing, documents go straight through processing versus touch a human versus discarded, obviously 100%. Now, when we do our calculations here, there is a human-in-the-loop rate here. That's the key. We want to find out how many times is a human touching it, because we want to find out their average handling time to get the total time, which will in turn correlate to the business value of the solution. Does it make sense, or do I need to do more optimization? Double clicking on document understanding and an automated solution. Here we have our customers or our vendors sending their documents into some document source. Maybe it's an inbox. And then we've got our document understanding solution and then the data destination. So document understanding encompasses everything in that orange box, and I'll go through that here. So maybe the document comes in as a zip file. Maybe it's multiple documents. We have to basically split those up. We have to figure out what they are, and then we need to extract the data. And there's a lot going on here. This is actually where machine learning lives, and we'll spend some time on that in a little bit. The first step after the data is extracted is, boy, we'd love to figure out if it was extracted correctly, and we'd love to do that automatically. And there are some tricks in something we call business rules, where it can provide that automated validation, where we can do some logic on the data. We can maybe do some simple math. We can look at date formats, or we can actually match them with a system of record. Daniel's going to spend a lot of time on this later, so I'll move on to the next step here, where if the automated validation wasn't done, or we found, no, we need to send that to a human because we have a rule in place to do so, we run this human in the loop process where we involve a document specialist. This is typically the people that are doing it today, although it doesn't happen to be. Typically, we want a document specialist that understands that document to take a look. So with that, they will receive not only the data that was extracted, but a picture of the document itself. And they will be basically given this guided validation process. So they're either going to look at the field and say, yes, that looks exactly like it extracted it correctly, hit submit, or they'll make a change and hit submit. But fundamentally, they are really, really efficient at doing this versus previously doing it manually. And so once submitted, then it goes into the data destination. So if we bring back our calculation before, where we had 20,000 hours, here total for 100% manual. With this case, we're now 1 minute per document. Even if 100% of the documents had to go to a human, because we're far more efficient at processing now, we still have this massive reduction in total time spent. And a more realistic number could be 50% verified, and we even further get that to 96% reduction in overall time spent. So substantial improvements here from an overall automation perspective, and also from making our people more efficient. Now let's take a closer look here at overall our end-to-end process when you look at machine learning with our typical RPA process. So we've got generically our data source, our data destination. RPA here, that's what's in our orange box. From an RPA perspective, we're going to do some data, call it data preparation. So in this case, when we look at machine learning, it typically likes to get the data in a certain format. So we're going to prep that data, and we could do that automatically with RPA. Now, when we need to get that prediction, we actually send that out to one of our machine learning models hosted in AI Center. And in the case of document understanding, that's our machine learning extractor. And you can see I highlighted here in the data prep, you can consider that the OCR phase, where we're actually getting the text out of the document, and we're basically putting it in a format to whereas the machine learning extractor can pull that data out and do some predictions. Once we do our predictions, we take that prediction along with a confidence score. So the machine learning model will produce a confidence score around what it thinks its success rate was for that prediction. It goes to automated validation. So again, those business rules where we can go out and we can do some external verification. We can do some simple math. If it doesn't check out, we'll put a human in the loop, and they'll make the corrections, and then they'll hit submit, and it'll go to the data destination. One thing I hadn't mentioned previously is, as that human is doing those validations, we can collect some of that data for fine-tuning that model. So hopefully this gives a little double click. And again, Daniel's going to touch on some of these concepts later and how to optimize some of them. But I'd like to spend a little bit of time on the out-of-the-box pre-trained machine learning models now. And so when you go to deploy a model within AI Center and Document Understanding, you're actually given a list of pre-trained models, meaning right out of the box, you can start processing these types of documents. So you get instant results. Now, we always recommend retraining those models for optimization. Now, I want to specifically highlight, so these are all the pre-trained models, but you can use a custom document type. It's actually the same machine learning model we used in the pre-trained, but we are basically able to create a custom document type. But it has no data set associated to it. I'll explain that in a minute. So here we go. We want to create a labeling session here where we've got our fields, we've got our typical set of production documents, and we go through this session of basically highlighting the areas on various documents and mapping them to those fields. The output of that is this thing called a data set. And the data set is either used to retrain the pre-trained model to make it that much better, or we'll use that training data set to actually train a brand new custom machine learning model. Finally, before I pass it over to Daniel, I'll talk about model performance over time. So as we look at model performance and we want to get that straight through processing rate as good as possible, it really comes in the form of a few steps. Number one, choosing one of those out-of-the-box models, you're going to have instant success. You're always going to want to retrain the model, whether it's a brand new custom model or it is out of the box, and that provides you even better efficiency and performance. We'll have those post-processing and business rules that can do that automated validation, so that increases straight through processing. And finally, that fine-tune with validated data, that taking those corrections that are done in human-in-the-loop and making them better. Now, it's important to note here that every improvement is very specific to your environment for multiple aspects of the variations that can occur. So keep that in mind. You always want to involve your document SME or business owner in this. There's a lot of questions and answers that need to be answered by them. And very important, if you've never done this before, you might want an experienced deployment partner to get this as good as it can be right out of the gate. So with that, I want to pass it over to Daniel, who's going to spend some time talking about some of the key ways to optimize a lot of the things I just described. Daniel, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Hey, everyone. Nice to be here with you all. So we are going to spend a little bit of time going further into some of the topics that Steve laid out here for us. At the intro of the session, one of the key things that we'll discuss here are, hey, what are some key aspects for how we optimize our solution? And from the UiPath side, what are best practices that we've seen, internally working or also working with customers and being able to share those experiences with you all? We're going to be focusing on first business rules. So we'll take a closer look at what exactly we mean when I mention business rules. Business rules is the logic that you can add into your automation workflow, your process, to automatically determine if a predicted value or a field or a classification is extracted correctly. So we're going to take an example of invoice processing. And if we start to discuss, just some scenarios where business rules would help us validate information that is extracting the document, we can categorize them into a few groups. One of those groups is just what can we do from a character validation standpoint? For example, being able to see that the model or the solution extracted the correct invoice number, but does that meet the expected number of digits or characters that we expect to be found for that field? The invoice number, for example, in a business process, you might always require it or expect it to be 7 digits. We can instill that business rule in our automation workflow to allow the robot to execute and carry out that business rule and return to us whether that business rule passed or failed based on the value that was predicted by the solution. Second, you can have business rules perform basic math operations. You can do things like taking the invoice line items here, summing those up, taking the tax amount, and then comparing the sum of those items against the total amount. And that's a way that you can have business rules cross-reference against the values of fields that have been extracted and determine if the total amount is going to align with what you expected to receive or process with this invoice based on what was found for other fields that are on the document. Third, we have another example, which is just date validation, being able to make sure that it follows the right date format. If you're always taking in documents from the US or America, you might expect it to be in a certain format versus if you're taking in documents compared to Europe. And then lastly, one of the more popular, more common ones is this external source verification, where we may have information that's found in a document, and we also have system of record, sources of truth, where you expect to be able to go ahead and query those system of records in order to validate whether the information in the document is matching up with what you had stored in that source of truth. For example, here we have a PO number that was found on the document, on the invoice. And so we can use that PO number to go ahead and query against a database or a system of record that exists where we have purchase order information. And that purchase order information can go ahead and tell us whether or not for this PO, it is indeed tied to the right vendor, and if it's tied to the right vendor ID, or if for some reason there's a mismatch and we need to take some action on that. And we'll go more into kind of what happens when you do have these kinds of system mismatches or document information mismatches and how to take next steps or how to resolve that. These are some key examples of how we see business rules being used. And again, one of the main benefits is, hey, is allowing us to automatically or programmatically validate information being processed from the document, as opposed to requiring human intervention. That kind of balance between automatic validation and processing and human intervention are two key factors with understanding the overall solution performance. And when we talk about best practices for understanding solution performance, we want to go ahead and really start to understand how we can categorize different exceptions, how we want to categorize the documents that are being processed without any human intervention. So we're going to go ahead and do that with an example here. So if we take 10,000 documents, we can go ahead and say, hey, we extracted data from those documents. We went ahead and actually applied business rules to those documents. And for half of those documents, we were able to process those without any manual intervention. For a portion of those documents, the remaining half, those required human intervention, human in the loop. And so a document specialist needed to go in, provide some input into them, and then we were able to process those after that manual intervention step. What you would want to do as a team is better understand the cause for that human intervention. And we like to categorize the reasons for human intervention into two main buckets. One is going to be events due to system processing, where we see information not being extracted from the data correctly due to a OCR issue. So the actual information couldn't be digitized or read from the document correctly, maybe because the quality was poor, or there's some pretty sloppy handwriting, or the model just did not find the actual field or value on the document that we were actually searching for. It didn't find the right value. So those are system processing events. And then the other category that we can kind of group human manual intervention cause events by is wrong or incomplete data, whether in the document or the system of record that we have on hand. External system issues, so there might be some mismatch of information, or a system might have been offline that didn't allow us to actually plug the information downstream. And then lastly, escalations or alerts based on the extracted data. And we'll go more into an example of what each of these mean. But I want you to keep in mind kind of how we separate these two categories. One is going to be more tied to the actual OCR engines or the extraction models that we're utilizing, or the classification models. And the other is going to be, things where things are just due to external influence, things that we want to go ahead and catch as a part of our end-to-end solution and understand the root cause and get a better understanding of the different dependencies outside of just the document understanding components. One example of an external event that we're looking at right now is when you have information that was extracted, but it does not, the cross-reference with the source of truth does not have the same information that was found on the document. So for example, here, the model for this invoice processing scenario was able to find the PO number. We looked at the supplier address as well that was extracted from the document, and there was a mismatch between the address found on the document and the address stored in our system of record. This is a scenario where you would want to go ahead and either send this information back to the vendor because you need to go ahead and report to them that, hey, you're using the wrong supplier address. Can you go ahead and correct this? Or is this the right supplier address you want us to update our system of records with? This would be, a scenario where from a model standpoint, the right information in the document was extracted, but you want to catch this exception because there's an external event that you want to go ahead and resolve. A second example is when we have another invoice where you had the PO number extracted correctly, but it was not found in your system of record or source of truth. And you don't want to be paying an invoice when you don't know if there's actually a PO number allocated to it, especially if it's a PO-based scenario. Or if you have a total amount that exceeds an automatic payment threshold, or that exceeds some kind of automatic reconciliation process, where you want to make sure you have a pair of eyes on that document because the dollar amount tied to processing that document is very high, and so you want to make sure with full certainty that you're processing that 100% correctly. These are scenarios where you would want to document SME to go ahead and investigate. How we go ahead, so knowing now kind of the different categories here and some examples of those external events, we want to discuss how you make the most of those events occurring, and balancing those with the automatic straight through processing that takes place, with your document processing initiative as well. How we transform those external human in the loop events or those system of processing events into positive outcomes is by first going ahead and categorizing those into their separate buckets. So we can take this example again of 10,000 documents and say, okay, I have 500 of those 5,000 that require human intervention. 100 of those are due to an OCR issue. They just weren't digitized correctly. 400, we couldn't find a field. A document specialist is going to correct that. But what I as a team, what we as a team can do is identify trends that we're seeing with these issues and see, oh, hey, maybe I can create a business rule or post-processing change that actually corrects or resolves this very common digitization issue in my process. Or maybe I need to go ahead and add more samples for a specific subset of formats and layouts so that my model can learn more about these invoices, these documents that the system is just not doing super well on. Or even opening up a bug or an incident with the UiPath team that you work with, right? These are all ways that we try and resolve these system processing issues. And then for the remaining documents that are impacted by external influences, if we take these 4,500 documents, these might be, again, examples of where you had invoices with mismatches between the system of record and the document. You had the wrong tax rate that was being used and cross-referenced, but failed in your system of record, or you had a batch of invoices that were actually marked as duplicates. And so these are all examples where you would want to go ahead and fix that system of record. You'd want to avoid reworking any documents, potentially even paying a document twice. And this is great that you can identify these, or being able to identify these is great because you're going to be able to add automation into your entire solution that can automatically resolve these. Hopefully, that's the goal. And being able to automatically resolve these is still going to add efficiency into your end-to-end solution, even though these 4,500 documents weren't able to be straight through processed without without some kind of human intervention, right? You're still going to get the actual resolution automated, which is going to increase your overall business value. Lastly, the key thing I want to make note of here is, we're talking about how to go ahead and kind of do a root cause analysis and what steps to take to go ahead and take action on these different events that you're categorizing. The key dependency is making sure you track these, that you have the necessary logging in place, that you calculate and analyze those metrics, whether you're using UiPath Insights or some other existing BI tool. And then lastly, I'll go ahead and we'll take a closer look into model performance. So we looked at solution performance, and now we can go ahead and take a closer look at model performance, which is kind of a subset of one of the components of understanding your solution performance. When we talk about model performance, we want to, and this is tied to those system processing events, we want to go ahead and observe those trends, which we mentioned earlier. We want to understand how we're performing on key metrics like field accuracy, or how we're performing in terms of accuracy for specific document sources. So that could be, for example, different vendors or different suppliers that we're receiving documents from. The tools we would use to observe those trends are Insights or AI Center. Insights is going to be that dashboarding tool in the UiPath platform. AI Center is going to be where you go ahead and maintain and deploy your models. Once we observe those trends, we've kind of identified what we want to do a further deep dive analysis into. We want to go ahead and start to understand the root cause. And some of the common root causes that we see are, due to inconsistent labeling, a biased machine learning model, or even low confidence scores, where low confidence scores might actually trigger human intervention, even though the value extracted by the model was indeed correct. And once we identify those using tools like Document Manager and like your automation workflow in Studio, where you might have those low confidence score thresholds, the common courses of action that we usually see are working as a team to reevaluate whether you can change those confidence thresholds you have in place in your workflow, reviewing the data labeling that has been performed to make sure it's not inconsistent or it's not causing any potential bias in the model where it's skewed towards a certain subset of vendors or document sources, or even retraining the model on a more diverse set of samples so that you can make sure that it's balanced and really represents what you're seeing in production from a document processing sample standpoint. The tools that you'll use to kind of go ahead and usually complete those common courses of action, products that we've mentioned before: Document Manager, UiPath Studio, and AI Center. Document Manager is where your samples are going to reside, your training samples, that's where data labeling takes place. Studio is where you build your entire recipe for what steps the robot is going to execute, and then AI Center is where you maintain, test, and deploy those machine learning models. From model performance, I mentioned data labeling. Data labeling is a key component to any document processing solution that uses a machine learning model. I want to dive a little bit further into how labeling can really impact a solution. And so we'll talk about some common pitfalls and some key items to remember. One of the common pitfalls we see is when a model has been built with non-critical fields included, and those non-critical fields are triggering manual intervention. And so I think the key thing to remember there is that you should really be defining your model to extract requirements. You should be linking every single item that your model learns about to a business requirement. And that's going to be done together as a team, together with the development team, the technical team, and the business stakeholders who are tied to that document processing initiative. Second, one of the other common pitfalls is when there's just bad training data from the machine learning model. When you have inconsistent labeling, when one team member labels a document one way and the other labels it another way, that's going to be confusing for the model. When you don't have enough samples for the actual model to learn from, or when it's just not, the actual training sample set is not representative of what you're processing in production. And the key thing to remember there to usually resolve these or avoid these is documenting very common edge cases, documenting the methodology with which you're going to go ahead and label documents as a team, and then also having the proper training, right? Working with SMEs or subject matter experts who know the documents very well to make sure information is being labeled correctly, to maximize what the model is learning from, and to make sure that it's accurate in order to avoid these common issues that are seen downstream. The last couple minutes here to just talk about what we see coming up in the future. We've talked about a lot, best practices for business rules, solution performance, model performance, and data labeling. From a product standpoint, we have a lot of things we're excited about. So one of those is enhancements to processing unstructured documents. Especially one that we're excited about is the integration with communication mining and document understanding. We are also really looking forward to adding capabilities that accelerate time to value. So getting you all into production much quicker. This is going to be tied to making our document understanding services available as APIs, going ahead and adding capabilities that are going to help with, that are just going to help perform real-time model retraining, that are going to help prevent that kind of model bias that often takes place when deployments get rolled out. Enhancing the user experience, also very high on our priority list. We're going to go ahead and try to improve the UX to help users build models faster and reduce that learning curve. And then lastly, we have some deployment insights and operations that are top of mind, where we're going to be adding enhancements to the insights document understanding focused dashboard templates, as well as some improvements to the validation station, which business users use to validate documents. We're really hoping that all the changes we have here in these 4 categories is going to make that learning curve a little bit reduced in terms of getting up and running and getting your automations tied to document processing into production much, much quicker. A lot of information, but I believe we are out of time. So I do appreciate you all joining us today. And please reach out if you do have any questions. We're happy to help. Please also reach out on or check out our public documentation. We have a ton up there and we're constantly updating it. It's been a pleasure chatting with you all.